They called him a dreamer, until the soldiers came at dawn. His village still sleeps in silence, the air thick with smoke and broken promises. He wasn't born a leader. The struggle made him one. When they took his land, he stood alone. When they took his voice, he taught others to speak. But behind every act of courage was a secret that could destroy everything he fought for. In a world where truth is forbidden, how far can one man go? Before his own people turn against him? They called him a dreamer, until the soldiers came at dawn. His village still sleeps in silence, the air thick with smoke and broken promises. He wasn't born a leader. The struggle made him one. When they took his land, he stood alone. When they took his voice, he taught others to speak. But behind every act of courage was a secret that could destroy everything he fought for. In a world where truth is forbidden, how far can one man go? Before his own people turn against him? The day the soldiers shut down Kofi's school, the village changed forever. What began as silence became anger, and what began as fear turned into whispers of defiance. Mothers hid their sons when trucks passed through, and fathers stopped looking at the ground when officials spoke. But Kofi, the quiet teacher, had already become something else in their eyes. A voice that refused to bow. By night he gathered villagers under the old baobab tree. There, by the light of oil lamps, they read the banned words of freedom and justice, fragile pages that could cost them their lives. Each gathering grew larger, each voice stronger. The regime called them agitators. The people called it hope. Soon, rumors spread beyond the village. In nearby towns, students painted slogans on walls before dawn. Farmers refused to pay unfair taxes. Market women began chanting Kofi's name when soldiers demanded bribes. The message was simple but dangerous. No one owns our silence. That's when the government struck back. They sent men in uniforms who smiled by day and hunted by night. Homes were raided. Radios seized. Friends vanished. One evening, as the rain fell heavy, Kofi found a warning scrawled in charcoal on his door. "Leave, or your lessons will end in blood." He knew what it meant. But how do you flee from the very soil that raised you? How do you run from a truth you've already spoken aloud? So he stayed. And that night, the soldiers returned. They stormed the village, shouting his name. The school was burned, the books turned to ash. Yet, in that chaos, something remarkable happened. People formed a circle around him. Men, women, even children stood between Kofi and the guns. Their fear had found a face, and it wasn't his anymore. The soldiers hesitated. No one had ever stood up to them before. The commander, eyes cold as steel, gave one last warning: disperse or die. But Kofi only said one thing: if knowledge is a crime, then let every child be guilty. They took him that night. No trial, no word, just silence. But silence, once broken, cannot be buried again. Days passed, then weeks. Yet the flame Kofi lit refused to die. Across villages, strangers carried his message. Teachers reopened secret classrooms. Songs were sung in his name, songs of courage, not sorrow. Even the soldiers began to whisper his words under their breath. The regime tried to erase him. Instead, they carved him into history, and as his story spread, the question haunted even those in power. If one teacher could awaken a nation, what would happen if the whole nation decided to stand? The prison where they kept Kofi was buried deep beyond the city, where even the wind forgot to speak. Days blended into nights, marked only by the echo of chains and the muffled cries of those who once dared to dream. But word of his capture had already spread like wildfire. Across the nation, protests erupted, small at first, then unstoppable. Farmers refused to harvest, students marched barefoot through the capital, and women wrapped in black stood before the governor's gates, chanting his name. The regime panicked. They thought breaking one man would silence millions. Instead, it had united them. Kofi's silence had become the loudest voice in the land. One evening, as thunder rolled over the horizon, the guards dragged him into the courtyard, battered, barefoot, but unbroken. A crowd of officials gathered, their faces lit by torches. The commander read his final confession, accusing him of treason. Kofi didn't speak. He only looked toward the sky, the same sky that stretched over his people. Then, From beyond the prison walls came the faint sound of singing. It was distant at first and soft, trembling, then louder. Hundreds of voices, then thousands. His people had come. The air trembled with a single word, freedom. The soldiers froze. Orders barked, guns raised, yet the chants only grew. Even some guards lowered their weapons, tears mixing with the rain. The commander turned to Kofi, rage in his eyes. "You did this," he hissed, and for the first time in days, Kofi smiled. "No," he whispered. They did. Lightning cracked. A gunshot split the night. Silence followed. But in that silence, the people did not run. They did not break. They knelt in the mud, singing louder than ever, a chorus of defiance that no bullet could kill. That night, the regime realized something terrifying. You can imprison a man, but not a movement. The rain did not stop that night. It washed the blood from the earth, but not the memory from their hearts. Kofi's body was gone by dawn, but his spirit had already escaped the walls that held him. In every village, candles were lit. In every school that had once been closed, children whispered his name as if it were a prayer. The government tried to hide the truth, but the truth had already found its voice in the people. Months later, the regime fell, not through war, but through the quiet, relentless courage of those Kofi awakened. Soldiers refused to shoot. Judges tore up false orders. Teachers reopened classrooms under the same trees where Kofi once stood. Freedom didn't arrive in a parade. It arrived in silence, in the simple act of refusing to kneel. Years passed. A statue was never built for him. No grand speeches were made. But his legacy lived in the eyes of a generation that refused to be afraid. They called it the Dawn Movement, a promise that no voice would be lost again. And even now, when storms rise across Africa, when leaders betray their people or injustice returns wearing new faces, Kofi's story returns like a warning and a reminder. That real power does not live in palaces or armies. It lives in ordinary hearts that refuse to surrender. So ask yourself, if silence built the chains, then whose voice will break them next? Because leadership is not a title, it is a choice. And sometimes it begins with just one teacher who believed that truth should never be forbidden.